My son laughed at my small retirement fund. He said, "You'll be working until you die." I quietly sipped my coffee and opened my laptop. I just sold my secret software for $85 million cash. That happened on a Tuesday morning in my kitchen in Knoxville, Tennessee. My son Tyler was sitting across the table from me. He had driven up from Nashville the night before with his wife Melissa for what he called a family check-in. What it actually was, I understood by the third cup of coffee, was an intervention. A soft one. The kind where people who love you sit across from you with concerned expressions and talk about your future in a way that communicates they have already decided what your future looks like. He had pulled up my retirement account statement on his phone. He had looked at it. He had said, "Dad, this is what you have saved after 32 years of working." I said, "Yes." He said, "This is not enough. This is not even close to enough. At the rate you are spending, you will run out of money in 8 years. I said, "Okay." He said, "You are 61 years old. 8 years from now, you will be 69. You will be working until you die." He said it with the specific frustrated love of a son who believed he was rescuing his father from a crisis his father had failed to see coming. He was not wrong about the retirement account. The retirement account was genuinely modest. What Tyler did not know, what nobody in my family knew, what nobody in Knoxville knew, what nobody except my attorney, my accountant, and a software company in Seattle knew, was that I had spent the previous 4 years building a software platform in my home office after everyone went to bed, and that 6 days before this kitchen conversation, I had signed a term sheet for the acquisition of that platform for $85 million cash. The closing was scheduled for 30 days out. I sat in my kitchen and I sipped my coffee. Tyler was still talking about assisted living options and maybe downsizing the house, and whether I had considered talking to a financial advisor. I opened my laptop. I said, "Tyler, before you go further with this, there is something I need to show you." He said, "Dad." I turned the laptop to face him. He looked at the screen. He stopped talking. Melissa leaned over and looked at the screen. The room was completely quiet for about 15 seconds. Tyler said, "What is this?" I said, "A letter of intent for the acquisition of a software platform I built. The purchase price is $85 million. Cash, closing in 30 days. Tyler looked at me. He said, "You built a software platform." I said, "Yes." He said, "By yourself?" I said, "Yes." He said, "In this house?" I said, "In the office down the hall. After you and your sister went to bed for most of your childhoods, and then after you both moved out, every evening for the last 4 years. He was very still. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, $85 million. I said, "Yes." I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. That was the moment. That specific quiet Tuesday morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a kitchen where I had eaten 30 years of breakfasts, and where my son had just told me I would be working until I died. He was wrong about the retirement account. He was wrong about everything he thought he understood about his father. And the story of how he got there, how a man who looked like a guy with a modest retirement account turned out to be something entirely different. That story starts a long time before that Tuesday morning. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you are new here. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Let us get into this from the beginning. My name is David Cowan, and I am 61 years old. I grew up in Maryville, Tennessee, a city about 15 miles south of Knoxville that had the specific texture of a working-class Southern community that was proud of itself in the genuine way rather than the performed way. People worked hard and paid their bills and showed up for each other, and did not spend a lot of time announcing any of this, because announcing it would have felt like showing off, and showing off was the specific social violation that Maryville took most seriously. My father, Earl Cowan, worked at an aluminum plant in Alcoa, Tennessee, for 37 years. The plant employed a significant portion of the county, and my father was one of its most reliable shift workers. Never sick, never late, never the person who created problems for the supervisor to solve. He went to work. He came home. He watched the Vols on Saturday and the Titans when they eventually existed, and he fixed things around the house on Sundays, with the patient, methodical approach of someone for whom doing the job right the first time was the only version that existed. He made a decent living. We lived in a house on Montville Road that had 3 bedrooms and a carport, and a yard that my father maintained with the same patient methodology he brought to everything. The neighborhood was the specific kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked in the daytime, and where the kids rode bikes until the street lights came on, and where everyone knew everyone's business, but most people had the decency not to say so. My mother, Helen Cowan, worked part-time at a fabric store in Maryville for 12 years, and then full-time at a medical supply company until she retired at 64. She was the social architect of our household, the one who remembered birthdays and organized holidays, and maintained the network of relationships that kept a family functioning across time and distance. She was also the one who noticed things. She noticed me, not in the dramatic way of a parent who recognized a prodigy, in the specific quiet way of a woman who paid attention and who understood that paying attention was the most important thing a parent could do. What she noticed was that I took things apart. From the time I was about 8 years old, I had a compulsive relationship with anything mechanical or electronic that stopped working correctly. Radios, clocks, the family television that went fuzzy in 1971, and that I spent 2 weeks taking apart and reassembling before I understood what was wrong with it and fixed it. My father found this useful. My mother found it interesting. She said once, when I was 10, that I was the kind of person who needed to understand how things worked from the inside before I was comfortable using them from the outside. She was right. That quality, the need to understand things from the inside, drove every significant professional decision I made for the next 50 years. High school was where I first encountered computers. Not the computers of today. The specific primitive computers of the early 1970s that required significant imagination to understand as the same category of thing as the devices that would eventually exist. Maryville High School had one computer terminal in the science wing that connected via telephone line to a time-sharing system at the University of Tennessee. I used it every opportunity I had. The teacher who supervised access to it was a man named Mr. Graham, who was 50-something and who had been teaching mathematics and science in Maryville for 20 years, and who understood that I was interested in the terminal in a different way than most students were interested in it. Most students found it novel. I found it essential. He let me stay after school twice a week. I learned basic programming in 1974 from library books, and from the specific trial and error of someone who had no formal instruction, and who had to derive the logic of programming from first principles applied to actual problems. This was the most valuable education I ever received. Not because basic was sophisticated, because learning something by deriving it from first principles with no instruction built a specific understanding of the underlying logic that people who learned from instruction sometimes missed. I understood why the code worked rather than just how to write it. I went to the University of Tennessee in 1981 on a partial academic scholarship and studied computer science and electrical engineering. The combination was deliberate. I wanted the theoretical foundation from computer science and the hardware understanding from electrical engineering, and I wanted to hold both simultaneously because I believed, correctly, as it turned out, that the most valuable capabilities in the technology field would belong to people who understood both the software and the hardware rather than just one. I graduated in 1985. I got a job at a technology company in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, writing embedded system software, the specific kind of software that ran inside hardware devices rather than on general-purpose computers. Industrial control systems, medical devices, communications equipment. The invisible software inside the things people used without knowing software was there. I was good at it. I spent 8 years in Research Triangle Park at 2 different companies, and I learned something in those 8 years that I did not fully understand the value of until much later. I learned how industries that were not technology industries thought about technology. Specifically, I learned how they thought about the problems technology was supposed to solve for them, and how often the technology they were buying was solving the wrong version of the problem, or solving the right problem in the wrong way. I sat in rooms with people from manufacturing companies and healthcare companies and logistics companies, and I watched them describe what they needed, and I watched the technology being sold to them, and I watched the specific gap between what they described and what they received. That gap was my education. In 1993, I came back to Tennessee. My parents were getting older. My father had had a health scare that turned out to be less serious than the first phone call suggested, but that communicated clearly that the period of my life where I was living 2 states away from my parents was probably coming to a natural end. I came back to Knoxville. I got a job at a manufacturing company in Oak Ridge that used a specific type of industrial control software that I had worked on variants of for 8 years. My title was Systems Analyst. My actual function was the person who understood both what the software was doing and what the manufacturing process needed it to do, and who operated in the specific gap between those 2 things. I met my wife Carol in Knoxville in 1994. She was a pharmacist at a hospital in downtown Knoxville. She was 31, practical in the specific way of someone who had been managing precise information for a decade and who had developed a relationship with accuracy that was one of the most attractive qualities I had ever encountered. We were married in 1995. Tyler was born in 1997. His sister Madison was born in 2000. I will tell you about Carol and about what happened between us in a later section, because it belongs in a later section. What I want you to understand about these years is the specific shape my professional life was taking that most people around me could not fully see. I was doing my job at Oak Ridge. And in the evenings after Tyler and Madison went to bed, I was working on something else. Subscribe right now and keep watching, because the next section is where I tell you about what I was building in the evenings, and why I spent 20 years building it before anyone knew it existed. The problem I started working on in 1997 came from what I had been watching for 12 years in industrial environments. Let me explain it in plain language, because the plain language is what made it valuable. Large manufacturing and industrial facilities ran on software that monitored and controlled their physical processes, temperatures, pressures, flow rates, equipment performance. This software was called Industrial Control Software, or SCADA systems. It generated enormous amounts of data about how the facility was operating minute by minute, and had been doing so since the late 1970s. The problem was that almost nobody was using the data. The data was being collected. It was being stored. It was sitting in servers in server rooms in manufacturing facilities across the country. And the engineers who worked in those facilities were making decisions about maintenance, about efficiency improvements, about equipment replacement, based on their experience and their intuition rather than on the data that was theoretically available to them. Why? Because the data was in formats that required significant technical expertise to access and interpret. Because the interfaces for accessing the data were designed by engineers for other engineers and required specialized knowledge to navigate. Because the data lived in different systems that used different formats and different terminology, and getting a coherent picture of what was happening across a facility required manually pulling information from multiple incompatible sources and assembling it by hand. The data was there. The ability to use it simply was not. I had been watching this problem for 12 years across multiple industries and multiple companies, and I had been thinking about the solution for most of those 12 years. The specific shape of the solution was clear to me by 1997. A platform that sat between the existing industrial control systems and the people who needed the information, that translated the data from the various source systems into a consistent format, that presented it through an interface that a plant manager or a maintenance supervisor could use without specialized technical training, and that identified patterns in the data, equipment behavior that predicted failures before they happened, efficiency opportunities that were invisible when you looked at any single data stream, but obvious when you looked at several simultaneously. Predictive maintenance and operational intelligence for industrial facilities. That was the product. I started building it in 1997 in the spare bedroom of our house in Knoxville that Carol had been using for storage, and that I converted, with her patient agreement, into an office. I want to be very direct about what the first 5 years of building this looked like. Slow. The early versions were rough in the way that first versions of genuinely ambitious software were rough. They did the core thing, but they did it in ways that were specific to the exact systems I had access to, and that required significant customization to work in different environments. I had no investors. I had no co-founder. I had a laptop and a collection of technical documentation for industrial control systems that I had accumulated over 12 years of working in the field, and that sat in binders on the shelf above my desk. I worked from 8 at night until midnight or 1 in the morning most weekdays. I worked Saturday afternoons while Tyler and Madison were at activities, and Carol was managing the household with the specific efficient grace she brought to everything. I never told anyone what I was building. Not because I was secretive by nature, because I had watched enough people in technology announce things they were building before they had built them, and I understood that the announcement consumed energy that the building needed and produced expectations that were impossible to manage at the scale I was working at, which was one person in a spare bedroom with no resources except time and knowledge. I kept building. The Oak Ridge job paid the bills. The evenings produced the product. By 2002, I had a version that worked consistently on 3 different industrial control system types. By 2005, I had added 4 more. By 2008, the platform handled 12 different source system types, and the predictive capability, the ability to identify patterns in equipment behavior that predicted failures days or weeks before they happened, was producing results that I was testing against historical data from the Oak Ridge facility and finding accurate at a rate that surprised even me. In 2008, I tried to show it to my employer. I arranged a meeting with the facility manager and the head of maintenance and the VP of operations, and I showed them what the platform did using their own data from the previous 3 years. The facility manager said, "This is useful." The head of maintenance said, "This is very useful." The VP of operations said, "How much does it cost and who built it?" I said, "I built it, and I want to discuss whether the company would be interested in licensing it." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms went quiet when something landed that people had not expected. The VP of operations said, "You built this?" I said, "Yes, over the past 11 years in the evenings." He said, "This is not something you built on company time or with company resources." I said, "No, My own time, my own equipment, my own resources. He said, and you want to license it to us? I said, I want to explore whether the company would be interested in a licensing arrangement. This is the version you would be licensing. I am also in the process of adding several capabilities that would make it more comprehensive. The VP of Operations said he would talk to legal. Legal came back 3 weeks later with a licensing offer that was, by any objective measure, underwhelming. A one-time payment for unlimited use within the Oak Ridge facility, with no royalties and no acknowledgement of the platform's value in other environments. I said no. He said, you are declining the offer. I said, yes. I built something with broader value than a single facility license. I want terms that reflect that. He said, we will not be improving the offer. I said, then I appreciate the conversation. I went back to my office. I kept building. Tyler came to me that year. He was 11 years old. He saw me in the office late one night and he stood in the doorway and he said, Dad, what are you always doing in here? I said, building something. He said, what kind of something? I said, software for factories. He said, why? I said, because there is a problem that needs solving, and I am the person who knows how to solve it. He said, is it going to make money? I said, I hope so, someday. He said, okay. He went to bed. Subscribe right now and stay right here, because the next section is where everything changes, and where the people who underestimated me start to understand what they were looking at. Carol and I separated in 2012. I want to tell this honestly, because the honest version is the only one that serves the story. We had been married for 17 years. We had built a good household and raised 2 good children, and we had remained genuine friends through all of it. What we had not remained by 2010 was a couple in the full sense of that. The specific distance that had been growing since the children were small, the distance produced by 2 careers and 2 parenting schedules, and my evenings in the office building something that Carol understood was important to me, but that she had never been fully inside. That distance became undeniable in 2010, when Tyler was 13 and Madison was 10, and the household was running well enough that both of us had to look directly at what was underneath the running well. What was underneath? It was that we had become excellent co-parents and comfortable roommates, and that the romantic partnership had dissolved slowly over years in the way that some marriages dissolved, without a single event, without betrayal, without cruelty. Just with the gradual, honest recognition that 2 people had grown into versions of themselves that were genuinely compatible in most ways, and genuinely incompatible in the ways that mattered for a marriage. We separated in December of 2012. The separation was handled with the specific careful decency that Carol brought to everything. We sat the children down together. We told them the truth in the age-appropriate version. We kept the household logistics as stable as possible, and we made clear, through action rather than just words, that both of us remained fully present parents regardless of the household structure. Tyler handled it with the specific withdrawn quiet of a 15-year-old who was processing something too large for the tools he currently had. Madison handled it with the specific angry directness of a 12-year-old who needed someone to be wrong about it, and who settled on me as the more available target, because Carol was the one who had initiated, and Tyler was the one who needed protecting. I understood this. I gave Madison the room to be angry. I showed up for everything. Every school event, every dinner, every conversation she wanted to have. I was the steady presence that I had always been, even as I was the person she was most comfortable directing her anger at, because that was the specific dynamic of the situation, and it was my job to be steady rather than to manage my own discomfort about being the target. The divorce was finalized in 2013. I kept the house. I went back to the office in the evenings. I kept building. What happened between 2013 and 2020 was the period of building that most people never saw, and that produced the thing that created the $85 million Tuesday morning. The platform, I had named it internally as Condition Core, a name I chose specifically because it described what it did rather than what it aspired to be. Went through 4 major version iterations between 2013 and 2019. Each version was more capable than the previous one. In 2015, I took 3 weeks of vacation time from my job at Oak Ridge, and I drove to 4 different industrial facilities in the Southeast: a chemical plant in Baton Rouge, a paper mill in Alabama, a food processing facility in Georgia, a plastics manufacturer in South Carolina, and I spent 2 days at each one watching how they managed their operational data. What I found confirmed everything I had been building toward. Every single facility had the same problem in variations of the same form: enormous amounts of operational data being collected and stored, almost none of it being used proactively, maintenance decisions being made reactively rather than predictively, efficiency opportunities invisible because the data that would reveal them was locked in incompatible systems. And at every facility, at least one person, usually a long-tenured maintenance engineer or a plant operations manager, said some version of the same thing. They said, "We know the information is in the data somewhere. We just have no way to get to it in a form we can actually use." I drove back to Knoxville with the specific settled feeling of a person who has confirmed that the problem they have been solving is real, and that the solution they have been building actually solves it. In 2018, I took early retirement from Oak Ridge. Not because I wanted to retire, because the platform was at a stage where the next phase of development required my full attention, and I could not give it full attention while working full-time. I had saved enough to live simply for 3 to 4 years. I reduced my personal spending to its minimum. I went to work full-time on Condition Core. Tyler was 21 in 2018. He was working in commercial banking in Nashville. He was building his own life with the specific energy of a young man who was confident in his direction and who had the specific combination of his mother's precision and my patience. He called me when I retired. He said, "Dad, you retired?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Your retirement account is not large enough to support full retirement at 60. I said, "I have expenses under control." He said, "But long-term?" I said, "I have things I am working on." He said, "What things?" I said, "Things I will tell you about when the time is right." He said, "Dad." I said, "Tyler, I have been making decisions about my own resources since before you were born. Trust me on this one." He said, "Okay." He did not sound fully okay, but he let it go. I spent 2018 and 2019 finishing what became Condition Core version 5. The capability it had in that version was genuinely different from anything available in the market. Not incrementally better, architecturally different in ways that produced results that facilities using competing systems could not produce. The predictive maintenance accuracy was tested across 12 months of historical data from 3 different facility types and was right about equipment failure predictions at a rate of 83%, with an average warning time of 11 days. 11 days of advance warning before equipment failure. In a manufacturing environment, 11 days was the difference between a scheduled maintenance window and an unplanned shutdown that could cost a facility hundreds of thousands of dollars per day. In late 2019, I reached out to an attorney in Knoxville who specialized in technology intellectual property, and I had every component of Condition Core properly documented and protected. Then in January 2020, I reached out to the first potential customer, a mid-size chemical processing company in Chattanooga that I had identified through research as having the exact profile of the facilities where Condition Core produced the most dramatic results. I sent their VP of Operations a 3-paragraph email. I said, I have a software platform that analyzes operational data from your control systems to predict equipment failures an average of 11 days before they happen. I can demonstrate this using your own historical data in a 2-hour session. I am offering the first demonstration for free with no obligation. He replied in 4 hours. He said, when can you come to Chattanooga? I came the following Tuesday. I ran the demonstration using 6 months of their historical data. At the end of the demonstration, the VP of Operations looked at his head of maintenance. The head of maintenance looked at the VP of Operations. The VP said, how many failures did your system predict in this data set that we actually had? I said, 14. Your system predicted 3 before they happened. Condition Core predicted all 14 with an average of 11 days warning. He said, how much does it cost? I told him. He said, when can we start? The Chattanooga facility became my first paying customer in February of 2020. By June of 2020, I had 4 customers. By December of 2020, I had 11. Word traveled in the specific way that word traveled in industrial circles, slowly, through the specific trust network of people who had worked in the same industry for decades and who called each other when they found something that actually worked. By the end of 2021, I had 23 customers across 6 states. By the end of 2022, I had 41 customers and annual recurring revenue of $4.2 million. That was when the inquiry started. Not from customers, from companies that wanted to buy Condition Core. Subscribe right now and stay with me, because the next section is where the acquisition process plays out, and where I explain exactly what the $85 million came from, and what Tyler said when he found out everything. The first acquisition inquiry arrived in March of 2022. A software company in Atlanta that made broader industrial operations software, and that had been watching Condition Core's growth in the market. They reached out through a mutual connection who knew both their business development director and my IP attorney. The number they proposed was underwhelming. I said no. I said it politely and without drama. My attorney conveyed the response. The Atlanta company came back with a higher number, still underwhelming. I said no again. I want to explain what I understood about my negotiating position in 2022, because the understanding drove the strategy that produced the $85 million outcome. Condition Core had 4 things that industrial software buyers valued in combination. First, the architecture. The specific way the platform handled data from multiple incompatible source systems was genuinely novel and protected by patents that I had filed in 2019 and 2020. Second, the accuracy. 83% predictive accuracy at 11 days average lead time was a number that the industrial operations software market had not seen before. Third, the customer base. 41 paying customers with a 91% renewal rate and growing. Real customers with real results. Fourth, the growth trajectory. The revenue curve was steep and the market was large and the competitive position was strong because the architecture was hard to replicate quickly. A company that acquired Condition Core was not buying current revenue. They were buying a market position in a category that was going to grow significantly as more industrial facilities understood what predictive analytics could do for their operations. I needed a buyer who understood all 4 things. The Atlanta company understood the revenue and the customer base, but was not sophisticated enough about the architecture to understand why it was defensible. I kept talking to them while I looked for the right buyer. My attorney connected me with a technology investment banker in Chicago named Mark Reeves, who had 15 years of experience in industrial software, and Mark read the condition core documentation in 2 days and called me back. He said, "David, this is the most interesting thing I have seen in industrial predictive analytics in a decade." I said, "Yes." He said, "You built this by yourself?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" I said, 25 years total, 4 years at full intensity. He said, "Do you understand what you have here?" I said, "I understand it well. I built it." He said, "The Atlanta company's number is embarrassing." I said, "Yes." He said, "Let me run a proper process." I said, "Yes." A proper process meant Mark identifying the companies most likely to value condition core correctly. Companies large enough to deploy it across significant customer bases, sophisticated enough to understand the architecture, and strategically positioned where the acquisition would genuinely accelerate their market position. He identified 7 companies. He reached out to all 7 simultaneously. 6 responded with serious interest. The process ran for 3 months. The 6 companies competed against each other in a way that is designed to produce the best outcome for the seller. Each knowing they were competing, each therefore motivated to put their most serious offer forward rather than testing with a low number. The final 3 bids came in within a range. The highest was from a technology company based in Seattle called Apex Industrial Systems that had a significant existing customer base in the manufacturing sector, and that correctly understood that condition core's architecture would allow them to offer predictive capabilities that none of their competitors could match. Their number was $85 million. Cash. No earnout. No extended employment requirement. $85 million at closing. I was sitting at my desk in the office on a Tuesday evening when Mark called me with the final number. He said, "David, $85 million, cash, 30-day closing. This is the Apex offer." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "Yes." He said, "Yes to the offer." I said, "Yes to the offer." He said, "David, do you understand what just happened?" I said, "Yes, a 25-year problem got solved." He said, $85 million. I said, "I know the number, Mark." He laughed. He said, "Most people would be jumping up and down right now." I said, "I will do that later. Right now I need to call my attorney and review the term sheet." I called my attorney. We reviewed the term sheet. I signed it. I closed my laptop. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the specific quiet of a house where something enormous had just happened, and where the house itself looked exactly the same as it had before. 6 days later, Tyler sat across from me at the same kitchen table and told me I would be working until I died. I sipped my coffee. I opened my laptop. I turned it to face him. What happened in the hour after that Tuesday morning was the most important conversation Tyler and I had had since he was a teenager. He looked at the term sheet for a long time. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, $85 million. I said, "Yes." He said, "You built software." I said, "Yes." He said, "In this house?" I said, "Down the hall, the office." He said, "I thought you were doing hobby stuff in there." I said, "You never asked what I was doing in there." He was quiet. He said, "When did you start?" I said, 1997. You were a few months old." He said, "Before I was born." I said, "The early version, yes." He said, 25 years. I said, "About that." He looked at the kitchen. He said, "You sat here for 25 years building something worth $85 million, and you never told anyone." I said, "I told people when there was something to tell. There was something to tell 6 days ago." He said, Mom knew. I said, your mother knew I worked on software in the evenings. She knew it was important to me. She did not know the specifics. He said, why didn't you tell people? I said, because telling people about things you are building before you have built them consumes energy the building needs. And because the people who would have mattered, the people who would have wanted to invest or get involved or influence the direction, I did not want them in it. It was mine. I built it the way I wanted to build it, and it worked the way I believed it would work, and I did not need anyone's opinion about whether it was viable. He was very still. He said, we thought. I said, I know what you thought. You thought I was a man who had not saved enough for retirement and who was going to need help from his children in his 60s. He said, I was worried about you. I said, I know, and that is a good quality in a son. Being worried about your father means you are paying attention. He said, I was wrong about what I needed to be worried about. I said, yes. He said, Dad. I said, yes, Tyler. He said, I am sorry I laughed at the retirement account. I said, I know. He said, I should not have said what I said about working until you die. I said, no, but you said it from a real place. You were concerned, you just had incomplete information. He said, very incomplete. I said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, can I ask you something? I said, ask. He said, are you happy? I sat with the question. I said, yes. Building something for 25 years and having it work the way I believed it would work, yes, I am happy. He said, and the money? I said, the money is useful. It is also mostly irrelevant to whether I am happy. I would have built this whether the outcome was 85 million or 8,500. He said, why? I said, because the problem needed solving, and I was the person who knew how to solve it. He said, that is the same thing you told me when I was 11. I said, yes. He said, I thought you were just saying something to explain why you were in there so late. I said, I was telling you the exact truth. He looked at his coffee. He said, what happens now? I said, the closing is in 30 days. After that, I have 30 days of transition support for Apex. Then I am free. He said, what will you do? I said, I will think about the next problem. He said, another 25-year project. I said, probably not that long. I am more efficient now. He looked at me. He said, you are serious? I said, there are a lot of problems that need solving. I know how to solve a certain category of them. Why would I stop? Melissa, who had been quiet through most of this, said, Mr. Cowan, you are remarkable. I said, I just paid attention to the right things for a long time. That was the honest answer. Stay right here for the final section, because I want to tell you what the closing day looked like and what came after. The closing happened on a Friday in September. My attorney's conference room in Knoxville, Mark on video from Chicago, the Apex legal team on video from Seattle, my attorney and me in person with the specific quality of a room where something significant is about to be finalized and where everyone in the room understands the magnitude without needing to say so. The documents were signed. The wire transfer confirmation arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon. My attorney said, congratulations, David. Mark said, David, it has been a privilege. I said, thank you both for everything. I drove home. I sat in the kitchen. I made coffee. I called Carol. She picked up on the second ring. She said, David. I said, Carol, the closing happened today. She was quiet. She said, the software. I said, yes. She said, how much? I told her. She was quiet for a long time. She said, David James Cowan. I said, yes. She said, you built that in our spare bedroom for how long? I said, 25 years. 17 of which were in our house. She said, "Well, I thought you were doing hobby programming." I said, "I was doing more than hobby programming." She said, "Apparently." She was quiet. Then she said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. That is all I ever wanted to know about it." I said, "I know." She said, "Tell the children." I said, "Tyler already knows. I will call Madison tonight." Madison took the news the way Madison took most large pieces of information, with a 15-second silence followed by a flood of specific questions. She said, "Dad, you built a software company by yourself?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Since before I was born?" I said, "The early version, yes." She said, "And sold it for $85 million?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you never told anyone?" I said, "I told Mark and my attorney when the time was right." She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Because the building was the thing. The telling would have changed what the building was. People's expectations and opinions and advice would have been in the room with me every evening when I was trying to work, and I did not want that. I wanted to solve the problem the way I believed it needed to be solved." She said, "And it worked?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Dad?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I am proud of you." I said, "I know." She said, "I was not the easiest kid after the divorce." I said, "You were a 12-year-old girl whose parents were separating. You were exactly as easy as you should have been." She was quiet. She said, "You were always there." I said, "Yes." She said, "Even when I was angry at you?" I said, "Especially then." She said, "Because that was when I needed you most." I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." She said, "Okay, Dad." I said, "Okay, Madison." I called Tyler the next morning. We had a longer version of the kitchen conversation, the version where we talked about things that needed time to settle before they could be talked about properly. He asked about the next thing. I said, "I have been watching a problem in supply chain data management that has a similar profile to what Condition Core solved. Similar gap between the data that exists and the ability to use it." He said, "You are going to build another one?" I said, "I am going to start thinking about another one. The building takes time." He said, 25 years. I said, "I am hoping for fewer." He laughed. Real laughter. The specific laughter of someone who had adjusted their understanding of their father and found the new understanding more interesting than the old one. He said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The retirement account, the one I pulled up on my phone at the kitchen table." I said, "Yes." He said, "Was that all you had, before the closing?" I said, "No." He said, "What else?" I said, "The house paid off, some savings, an investment account that was modest." He said, "So you were not in the financial trouble I thought you were in?" I said, "No. I had been living simply by choice, not by necessity. I reduced my spending to leave resources available for building. That is a different situation from not having resources." He said, "And you let me worry about you for a year." I said, "I told you I had things I was working on." He said, "You said exactly that." I said, "Yes." He said, "And I chose to interpret that as something small." I said, "People assign size to things they have information about. You had incomplete information." He said, "And you could have given me more information." I said, "Yes, I chose not to." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because your worry about me was real and genuine, and it came from a good place, and because the answer was coming. 30 days from when you sat across from me, the answer was going to be visible. I did not want to shortcut that by announcing something before it was complete." He said, "Because announcing things consumes energy." I said, "Yes." He said, "You really mean that?" I said, completely. He said, how many other things are you working on that you have not told us about? I said, right now I am thinking about a supply chain problem. That is the early stage version. There will be a long time before there is something to tell about it. He said, and when there is something to tell? I said, I will tell you. He said, promise. I said, I will tell you when the time is right. That is a better promise than telling you on a timeline that serves your comfort rather than the work. He said, Dad. I said, yes, Tyler. He said, that is the most you thing you have ever said. I said, thank you. He laughed again. Good laughter. Here is the thing I want to leave you with. I built Condition Core for 25 years without telling most people it existed. That sounds dramatic, like a secret, like something I was hiding. It was the opposite of hiding. Building something for 25 years without announcing it is the specific discipline of someone who understands that the work is the point, and that the work requires protection from the things that interfere with it. The opinions, the doubt, the advice from people who care about you, but who do not understand what you are building. The expectations that attach to you once you announce something, and that pull the building in directions the building does not need to go. I protected the work by keeping it quiet. The result was that when the work was finished, it was finished on its own terms, the way I believed it needed to be built, at the quality level I believed it needed to reach, solving the problem the way I understood the problem needed to be solved. And it worked. 83% predictive accuracy at 11 days lead time, 41 customers with a 91% renewal rate, $85 million at closing. All of it came from 25 years of evenings in a spare bedroom. Tyler thought I was going to be working until I died. He was not wrong to be concerned. He had incomplete information, and he drew a reasonable conclusion from it. That is not a failure of care. That is what happened when someone you love keeps the most important thing they are doing private until it is ready to be seen. The lesson is not to hide what you are building from the people who love you. The lesson is to understand the difference between keeping the work protected and keeping the work secret. I was protecting the work. When it was ready, I showed it. Tyler saw it. He understood. That was the right order. My father worked at an aluminum plant for 37 years. He did his job completely and without complaint, and he came home and he fixed things around the house on Sundays, and he watched Tennessee play on Saturdays, and he was present for everything that mattered. He did not build software, but he taught me the specific quality that made the software possible. He taught me that the work was the point, that showing up for the thing every day was the whole strategy. That patient, consistent work in the right direction produced outcomes that looked miraculous from the outside, and that felt inevitable from the inside. He never saw Condition Core. He passed in 2015, while I was in the middle of version 4. But he would have understood it. He would have said, you showed up every evening for 25 years. He would have said, that is the whole thing. He would have been right. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you are building that nobody knows about yet. Tell me what problem you have been watching that needs solving. Tell me where you are watching from. I read every comment. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, new story every week. Everyone worth the time. Thank you for being here.